Hi everyone. This is my first ever tutorial. I'm really excited to share what I know, and I hope that this helps somebody. Today we're going to be tackling poor viewport performance in Blender when we have a scene that has a lot of nature assets that are all high poly, as well as a character that is high poly, and dynamic paint going on and creating water ripples and all of those things. So when we press play, we can see here that we have a whopping 3 frames per second, which makes it impossible to get a gauge of what kind of animation timing you're working with. And so using geometry nodes, we're going to create a global switch that will turn off all of the heavy elements in our scene, allowing us to see our playback performance in real time. We can art direct all of this animation. And then when we're done, we turn that switch back off. And then here are our high poly assets ready to render. So let's get into it. Welcome everybody. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be animating a fern blowing in the wind, but it's a fairly dense fern. And so to keep it performant and to keep everything playing in real time when you've got a scene with a bunch of these in it, we're going to be creating a low poly proxy using an add-on called Quadremesher, which is a paid add-on, but very, very worth it, made by the same guy that created the Z-Remesher add-on for ZBrush. So anyway, you're going to love it. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the vertex count of this fern, which is about 330,000. And you can imagine if you duplicate these throughout the scene and you've got an entire environment and you want these blowing in the wind and you've got modifiers and subdivisions going, that it's not going to play back at 24 frames or even close to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a proxy for this guy, and let's start there. So I'm going to select this guy. I'm going to open the N panel, and then we're going to go to Z-Remesher and or Quadremesher, sorry. And I'm going to leave the settings at default and just press remesh it. And it's not actually going to create 5,000 quads. It's going to be more like 50 or 60,000 quads, which seems like a lot, but in reality, it'll hold up. So while we're waiting for this, the next thing that we're going to do is when we have the new proxy, we're going to remove all of the materials that were attached to this original high poly one. And here it is. It's already done. So you can see if I toggle this one, if I toggle the original one on, that it's a pretty close visual approximation of the two, even though there's some pieces kind of floating in the air and stuff. It doesn't really matter. It'll help you to be able to place this thing in a scene. And when you're looking through the camera, you'll have a good idea of like, this is one of the leaves that's going to be, you know, in focus, and then that one will be in the out of focus in the background and stuff. So that's one of the reasons why I like this Quadremesher add-on, is because it does give you a closer visual approximation. Obviously, the less quads you use, the less things are going to be visible. You can see some of these leaves are not connected, so it does its best. But for our purposes, I think it's going to work really well. So, all right. Next thing we're going to do, we've got our low poly proxy. We're going to rename this thing because we always want to stay organized, since we're going to be typing in the names of things. That this will be the low poly fern, and then the high poly is going to be, we're going to reveal it, and we're actually going to hide the low poly version of it. And so I'm going to click here on the high poly, and then we're going to create our geometry node setup. So I'm going to go over here to the corner and drag out another window. And then we're going to click here and go to geometry node editor. And then I'm going to hide the N panel for the geometry node editor. We don't need that open. And then in the high poly, or the original fern, we're going to go to the modifiers tab and then add a modifier, geometry nodes. And then you can see here that the modifier is in place. So it is attached to this object, but it's blank. So we're actually going to need to press the new button. And then now you can see here that we have a geometry node setup that's just connecting the input geometry to the output geometry with nothing happening in between. So let's stay organized and name this thing. I'm going to name it GN Proxy Setup, or Proxy Switch rather. And you can see here that this name, it carries forward like that up here in the geometry node editor. And then now we'll add the actual switch. So I'm going to hide this N panel over here because we don't need it to be cluttered. So Shift A, and then we're going to type switch. We're going to add that switch, and then we just drag it right on top of the noodle, and you'll see that it plugs in. The input goes to false, and then out to the group output. So when the switch is false, this is a Boolean value, so it's on or off. You can see it says here false, Boolean. If we press this switch button, then now the Boolean is activated, and it's a value of 1. And you can see that there's nothing plugged into true, so we don't actually see anything here. Now it's just an empty space. So what we're going to do is we want to plug the proxy into this spot. And the way we're going to do it is we're just going to go right over to the outliner. And even though it's hidden, we're going to drag it right into this window. You can see that it drops an object info node and then automatically places the object that we dragged into the slot, designated object. We're going to expand on this in a moment. For our purposes, let's just keep this simple, and we're going to do one thing at a time. So I'm going to make a little bit more space for us here and then push this guy over to the end. And then let's plug this geometry in to the true. And then you'll see right away that our proxy geometry appears. So now we've got a switch that when it is enabled, it is showing the proxy geometry. When it's disabled, it shows you the high poly geometry. So this by itself is already a really useful setup. You can go here, you can right click, you can mark it as an asset, you can save it to your asset browser, drop this thing on a high poly object, create a low poly proxy, and then you're good to go. So by itself, very useful, but we're going to elevate this and take it to this next level. So how we're going to do that is we want it to be infinitely reusable for more objects that you drop into the scene. So let's take this object info. We're going to create a little bit more space here. And then we're going to add a proxy material in. So we're going to go to set material and then put it in between the object info for the proxy object. And then this material slot is where we're going to create a proxy material, and we're going to drop it right in here. So first, to make this thing reusable, we want to take all of the relevant settings and then plug them into the group input so that they will appear here on the side in the modifier panel. So let's start with the switch itself. We're just going to drop it onto this empty slot. You can see here it says switch. It's now connected to the switch. And then right there in the modifier panel, we can press this on and off, and done. So now if you don't have, the geometry node setup selected, then you can just go to the modifiers, just like anything else, subdivision, surface, or bevel, or whatever, and you'll be able to turn this thing on or off. So super useful, but we're gonna take it up another notch from here, and we're gonna plug the object input into a blank slot here. So now you can see that we've got the switch, nothing, because technically this object that was assigned here to low poly, that's now in the group input. So from the modifier panel, you're able to click this eyedropper and then select your proxy object right there. And then lastly, we're going to take the material slot and plug that in underneath object. And so now what you're going to do is you're going to be able to designate your proxy object, and you're going to be able to designate the proxy material here in the modifier panel. So we don't have that proxy material yet. We're going to go and make it. The way that we do this is we're going to select the object, which you can't do if it's not visible in the viewport. So now we're going to enable visibility. We're going to click on that thing, going to go down to the material panel, and you can see that even though we ran it through Quadremesher and the geometry is decimated, all of these material slots are still full of the same materials that are assigned to the high poly. The reason why we want to make a proxy material is because when you decimate the geometry, you're also removing the UV coordinates. And so any of the textures that are assigned to the high poly are not going to be displayed correctly or at all. And so these slots don't really do us any good. So what we're going to do is we're going to just start removing them one by one. And as soon as all of them are gone, we're going to create a new slot that is empty. And then we're going to create a new material by clicking here. And then we'll stick to our standard naming convention, capital M underscore, let's call this thing Fern Proxy. So we know that it's a material, it belongs to the fern, and is designated as a proxy. And it's white, So we want to change this to something a little bit more, something that more closely resembles the original object's color. So here we just set the base color. We don't need to mess with anything else. This is just a temporary material that you can use while you're working, just so you can feel like you're not looking at a bunch of just a bunch of things that don't have any color. All right, so we've got the material set up, and now when we click on our high poly, you can see if we go back to the modifier panel, there's nothing in this material slot, so it's technically empty. So now if we click here and type proxy, there's our material, mfern proxy. So we'll assign that. So now we've got the low poly, we've got the proxy material, and I'm going to hide this this low poly from view, and then we turn the switch on and off, and boom, there is both. So again, this is far enough, but you can do a lot more with this. And what we're going to do to take it to the next level is that we're going to take the high poly, because if you're going to work in a scene with multiple plants, then you're going to want to use this switch for a bunch of them. So I'm going to hit Shift D, and then I'm going to duplicate it and then move it along the X axis. Now we've got two individual objects, both of whom are referencing this, this low poly proxy fern model. And if we want to be able to turn all of them on and off at the same time, we're going to need to find a way to not have to click on each individual object and then turn these switches on one at a time, because when you've got dozens of things in the scene, it's going to become really tedious doing this. So the way that we're going to go about it is we're going to create first a custom property, which these are really fun and super versatile. And then we're going to create a driver that is going to take that custom property and then assign it to a bunch of different things in the scene. And so I'll show you how this works. So first things first, we need to make the custom property. So we're going to go to scene. You can also do this using an empty for a controller, but there's a trick that I want to show you that works really well if you assign it, if you make a custom property to the scene. You can make custom properties in a bunch of different places, and it's more of an organizational thing depending on what data you want them to be attached to. So we're going to make more of like a global kind of a property that's going to be attached to the entire scene, because we want to be able to turn proxies on and off for the scene rather than just at the object level like an empty. Let's make our first custom property. So I'm going to go here to the scene tab. I'm going to click new, and then we've got our default custom property. It comes in as a float value. We want to change it to a Boolean value by clicking there in the settings, changing it to Boolean, and then renaming it to proxy underscore switch. So this name is going to be relevant because we're going to be typing it in a very specific way in a moment. And I'll show you how that works next. So we've got this switch. We can toggle it on and off. You can see that it's doing absolutely nothing. But if we use it as a driver, it's going to be able to turn all of these on and off. So we've got this switch. We're going to go to our first high poly object, go back to the modifier tab. And then here in the switch, we're going to right click on this guy, and then we're going to add a driver. And you can see here that this window pops up for adding a driver. And by default, it's a scripted expression, but what we want is an averaged value. We can select averaged value, and what we need for a variable is a context variable from the active scene. And then that variable, context property, sorry, is called a context property, and it's going to be called proxy switch. And then what we need to do is we need to type proxy switch into this path. And there's a specific way that you have to go about doing this, which is that you need to put it in brackets. So I'm going to hit the bracket and then the quotations. Okay. So, and then proxy underscore switch, and then another quotation, and then close that bracket, and then boom, now it's good to go, and we have our driver set up. So what you'll see here is that when we try to click on this switch, it does nothing because it's being controlled by the custom property in the scene called proxy switch that we just created. So when I press this, you can see now that it turns the proxy on and off. So now that we have the switch, we're going to be able to use this thing for a bunch of different things that we can enable or disable. So we've made our driver. We can right click on the driver. We can copy the driver, and then we can go to the other fern that we have that we would like to have this switch be driven by that custom property that we made. And that is now, since we've already created it, as easy as right clicking and then paste driver. So now you can see we try to click here, nothing. But if we go to the scene and then hit the proxy switch, boom, both of them are controlled by the same one switch. And then if we want to take this to the next level, because who wants to click on scene, go down to custom properties, click on this proxy switch? We don't want to do that. So we're going to right click on this thing, and then we're going to add it to quick favorites. Mine was already added, so I removed it. Now I'm going to add it back. And then when you hover over the viewport here and press Q, there it is, proxy switch. And then you can just press Q and enable and disable the proxy switch. So this is awesome. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take it up another notch by having it adjust a bunch of other modifiers that would kill the performance of your scene when you have a lot of different objects. So if we add in a cube, and this cube is massive, we're going to make the cube smaller. We'll make it something like 30 centimeters. And then let's just move it over here somewhere. And then in the modifiers, we're going to add a subdivision surface, because when these are enabled, they slow things down and your viewport playback is going to be hindered by this. So we've got our switch. We love our switch. We want this switch to be able to turn this viewport visibility for this modifier on and off. And since it's a Boolean value, it's possible to do this. And the way that we have to do it, and then this is where it gets a little bit tricky, and it took a little bit of time to figure this out, is that we need to go into the driver editor window to make this happen. So we go to an object that already has the driver assigned, and then we copy that driver, and we go to the cube, and then in the subdivision surface, we're going to right click on this guy, and we're going to paste that driver there. So you can see now that these are the high poly versions, and then the subdivision surface is turned off. So it's basically inverted. So when we go and we turn our proxy switch on, it turns on the proxies for the ferns, but it also activates the subdivision surface rather than deactivates it. So what we need to do is we need to find a way to invert the driver so that it works. Okay. The way we're going to do it is we're going to right click here, and then we're going to open the drivers editor. Now we've got this window where we can edit this specific driver. So we have it selected here. And then if we go over to our modifiers, we add a modifier, and then we add a generator. And then that generator needs to be a factorized polynomial, which this sounds complicated. I don't know what any of this is. All I know is that in order to invert this thing, you have to set it to -1 here in the A. And that's basically it. That's the whole thing. Okay. So now when we go over here and we hover over this, the proxy switch, we turn it off, and then we have our subdivided cube. We have our high poly ferns. These guys are great. Now we can press Q again, turn on the proxy switch. We have our low poly ferns. We have our subdivision is turned off. It's going to be turned on in the render. This is independent of that driver. So you're good to go. And when you add more things to the scene and you want to control more objects using this same driver setup, you just you right click, and then you copy that driver, and then you go to another thing. Like if we add another modifier, and then we call it like a bevel modifier. If we want to control this guy, we paste that driver, and then boom. Now the bevel is turned on and off. The subdivision is turned on and off, and our high poly ferns are turned on and off. So this is how it works. And then when you add more plants into the scene or other geometry that you want to use a switch value, then you're going to cut and paste from the switch, or copy and paste from the switch driver. So I don't know if that makes sense. I hope that it does. You can always rewatch it, but this is how you control an entire scene using one proxy switch. And next thing that we're going to do is we're going to, for the bonus round, we're going to animate a little bit of wind with these ferns, so I can demonstrate the real-time playback with the proxies turned on. So the way that we're going to do that is we will turn off the proxy switch. We've got our high poly geometry, and then we'll go here and add a modifier, and then we're going to go to, let's see, we're going to go to deform, and then we're going to go to simple deform, and then we'll use a bend. We use the bend mode here, and then we'll choose the X axis like this, and you can see where we're going with this is that when you adjust the angle like this, you can keyframe that, that it'll look like it's blowing in the wind. So what we really want to do here is, if we set this thing to 0, we want a relatively low value to oscillate slowly over time. And so the way that we're going to go about doing this is I'm going to go back to our first frame here, and then we're going to set a keyframe for angle, and it's here at 0. And then let's open our animation editor up a little bit wider. We don't actually need to see our geometry node set up anymore because that's all taken care of. But what we do want to do is we want to add some noise. And the way that we can add some noise to a keyframe so that it can be kind of procedural is that we'll go to the graph editor here. And then now that we've got this one keyframe already created, you can see it says angle for simple deform. That's this guy right here. That if we press the N, it'll open up the N panel in the graph editor. And then when you go to modifiers here, you have the option of adding a noise modifier. And then you'll see that now that we've added this noise, when you press space, we've got this this noise that is making it, you know, it's crazy right now. But if we dial some of these settings in, like taking the strength down a little bit, you can see what's happening here is that the noise is getting smaller, and we'll set the strength to something like 0.01. And then if we take the scale, actually it's a little difficult to see if we adjust the strength first, but if we take the scale and we make this scale smaller, then you can see the spacing between the different peaks and troughs of the noise are going to, they're going to space out. And so that kind of slows it down a little bit. And the strength of it is basically the intensity. You can see here that it kind of fluctuates between, I guess, -20 and +20, give or take, you know, something like that. So we'll take the strength, and then we'll pull it down, and I'm holding shift to get a more granular kind of movement here. And then now if we go back to our first keyframe and we press play, you can see it's a lot more gentle. And so this is very salt to taste. We're going to do something like 0.05 in the strength. And then now you can see that it looks like it's being affected by the wind, although only on one axis, which is the X axis. So what we can do here, now that we've got this thing already set up, is that we'll go and we'll duplicate this modifier, and it helps to name these. So this is going to be, actually, we're going to name the modifiers themselves. So this is noise-X, just so we can visually differentiate what's going on. You can see here that the color red represents this X axis. When I go here and then click on Y, we're going to now do the same thing. We're going to bend along the Y axis, and we'll just repeat this. We'll just repeat the same process. We'll add a keyframe on the first frame, and now you can see this is green representing the Y axis, but it helps to stay organized. So when I click here, we've got our modifier for noise on the X, but we don't have any modifier for the Y. So I'm going to go back to our keyframe modifier, and then we've got these really convenient ways of copying the modifier and then going to this other keyframe and then pasting that modifier. And these settings have carried forward as well. So I'm going to take this modifier, rename it noise Y, so that you can differentiate where you're at. And then we're going to enable that modifier. And now we've got the same values on the X and the Y axis. You can see that they're being adjusted. What I recommend when these are set up the same way, that they're going to be moving in kind of a diagonal because it's using the same seed to move it back and forth. So what I recommend is just offsetting it slightly. And if I crank the strength here, then you'll see what the offset is doing. It's just moving that noise. So I'm going to undo the strength. And then now we just randomly pick an offset just so the noise is different on the X axis and the Y. And then when you press play, you can see here that it is moving back and forth. So this is great, but that is exactly why we did this proxy setup, is that we're looking at 15 frames per second. But if we go to our scene settings here, that we actually, our frame rate is 24 frames a second. So we want this to be performant in real time. Hence the proxy switch. When we enable this thing and we press play, you can see right away that it's playing in real time. And that's the whole point of this thing. So now that we've got that, you can do the same modifier setup that we've got for animating this to this fern and many other things in the scene, and then they'll work the same way. So I hope that helps somebody. Definitely going to help me, because remembering all these steps, I did this about a couple of months ago, and if I didn't take copious notes, I just would not have figured it out again. So thank you everybody for your time and for watching this all the way through. And I would love to hear in the comments if you have a better way of doing this, or if it helped you out somehow. And yeah, I look forward to making many more of these. Thank you so much, guys. Bye.